Tonight, beneath a curtain of soft November rain, there stands a cottage, small, crooked, and half swallowed by ivy. A quiet place where time forgot to move. Welcome, dear listener, to the Cottage Beneath the Rain. Tonight's bedtime story, here on Midnight Murmurs Radio. I am Evelyn Blackwood, and I'll be your guide through this gentle, haunting night. A relaxing story, a sleep story, and a guided sleep meditation to carry you into rest. Before we begin, find a comfortable place to lie down. Let the outside world fade. Let the rain tapping at your window become your rhythm. Take a slow breath in and out. And out. Feel your shoulders loosen, your heartbeat soften. Close your eyes and imagine the scent of wet earth, cedar, and smoke drifting through an open window. Tonight, you are safe here. You are home inside this dream. Now, listen. The story begins where the forest meets the mist, where an old lamp still flickers, inside the forgotten cottage beneath the rain. Chapter 1, Part 1. The road to Waverly Hollow is narrow, winding, and always wet. Locals say the rain there never stops, as if the sky itself cannot let go of something long remembered. On nights like this, the air tastes like iron and pine. You can hear the distant hum of the river, swollen from weeks of downpour, and the lonely cry of a night bird echoing from the trees. When Margaret Whitlow first came upon the cottage, she thought it abandoned, a ghost of wood and moss, leaning into the storm. The shingles glistened black beneath the steady drizzle, and every step she took along the muddy path felt like walking through another century. She was 28, a writer from Charleston, searching for a quiet place to finish her book. But quiet in Waverly Hollow had a strange weight. It wasn't silence, exactly, it was listening. The landlord, an elderly man named Jonah Pike, had left the key under a flat stone by the door. "She's an old place," he had said with a crooked smile. "Likes company but doesn't talk much." Margaret thought he meant the creak of floorboards or the whisper of rain against the roof. Only later would she realize he meant something else entirely. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, lavender, and old smoke. The hearth was cold, but clean, as if someone had left it only yesterday. A single rocking chair faced the window, and beside it a small table held a cup of tea gone grey with dust. Margaret touched the handle and found it faintly warm, as though the rain itself remembered who once held it. She unpacked her notebooks, lit the lantern, and listened. The sound of rain on the roof was hypnotic, steady, like an endless lullaby. Somewhere between the patter and the wind, she thought she heard another rhythm, soft, deliberate, almost human, a slow creak, as if the rocking chair had begun to move. She turned, but nothing stirred, only shadows swayed with the lantern light. Still, something in the air shifted, a presence, not seen, but felt. Her pulse quickened, then steadied again. She laughed quietly to herself. "It's just the wind," she whispered, though the cottage did not answer. Outside, the forest glowed with the faint light of foxfire, that ghostly fungus that blooms after rain. The hills shimmered pale green beneath the mist, and from far off came the distant toll of a church bell. Margaret opened her notebook and began to write, her words tracing half-remembered dreams. A woman waiting by a window, a child humming to the rain, a voice that once said, "I'll be back before the storm ends." She didn't know where the line came from, but her hand trembled as she wrote it. Hours passed, unnoticed. The lantern's flame leaned and flickered, drawing her eyes to the reflection in the window pane. Her own face. Yes, but behind it, faint and soft, another, a pale silhouette of someone standing just outside, unmoving beneath the rain. She rose, heart heavy, breath caught. When she opened the door, the night greeted her with nothing but rain and the scent of wet leaves. Yet, from the corner of her eye, she saw footprints, small, bare, leading toward the forest and fading into darkness. The cottage sighed as she closed the door, a sound both weary and kind. She sat again, and for a moment thought she heard a whisper from the hearth, a voice soft as breath. "Welcome back." The voice had been so gentle that Margaret wasn't sure she'd truly heard it. Perhaps it was only the wind slipping through the chimney, or her mind playing quiet tricks after too many sleepless nights. Yet the sound of it lingered, a breath of warmth curling through the chill air, a tone that felt strangely familiar, like the echo of a childhood lullaby she could not quite recall. She rose from the rocking chair and let her fingers drift across the windowsill, tracing the thin line of condensation left by the rain. Each droplet quivered under her touch, as if listening to. The storm outside had softened into a steady drizzle. Through the wavering glass, the forest shimmered in shades of blue and silver, and the old gravel path glowed faintly beneath the lantern's reflection. She thought again of those small, bare footprints leading away into the mist. The shape of them, narrow, delicate, could have belonged to a child. But there were no children in Waverly Hollow. Jonah Pike had mentioned that only 5 houses still stood occupied in this part of the valley, and none within half a mile of hers. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was near, watching, perhaps waiting. Margaret wrapped herself in a wool blanket and settled once more into the chair. The fire in the hearth sputtered to life as she struck a match, the flame catching on the old logs with surprising ease. The warmth spread slowly through the room, chasing shadows from the corners. As she watched the flames twist and bend, she noticed something peculiar, the faint smell of rain-damp roses, blooming though no flowers grew nearby. The scent stirred something in her memory. A fragment of a story her grandmother once told, about houses that remembered their keepers and rain that carried their voices long after they were gone. "A home can love you," her grandmother had whispered once, "but it can also mourn." The thought comforted her more than it frightened her. Perhaps the cottage, in its loneliness, was simply reaching out. The wood beneath her feet creaked softly, like an old creature shifting in its sleep. She opened a notebook again and began to write. Not her novel now, but a letter that, to whoever lived here before me. She wrote, "Your house is beautiful. It feels alive. I hope you don't mind me staying a while." The act felt silly, but strangely right. She tore the page free, folded it neatly, and placed it on the mantel beside the faded cup of tea. Then she sat back, closed her eyes, and listened once more to the rain. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed. Time in Waverly Hollow had a way of unraveling softly, like thread between gentle fingers. The fire dimmed, and in the pale glow of the embers, the letter she'd written was gone. Only a small curl of ash remained where it had been. Margaret blinked, heart stuttering. The cup beside it, however, was no longer empty. It was full again, faint steam rising from its surface, carrying that same scent of roses. Her breath caught. She whispered into the stillness, "Who are you?" For a long moment, only the rain replied. Then came the sound of the rocking chair behind her, slow, rhythmic, steady. She turned, expecting it to be the wind again, but the air in the room had grown impossibly still. The chair rocked on its own, its wooden legs whispering softly against the floorboards. In the reflection of the firelight, she thought she saw a faint outline sitting there, the suggestion of shoulders, hands, a bowed head. The figure did not look up. Instead, a quiet voice drifted through the room, tender and hollow. "It's been such a long time." Margaret's fear melted into something else, sorrow, maybe, or recognition. She wanted to speak, but no words came. The cottage seemed to breathe with her, its walls swelling and settling in rhythm with her heartbeat. Outside, the rain fell heavier again, tapping against the window like fingers seeking to be let in. The presence did not move closer. It simply remained there, patient and calm, as though waiting for her to understand. And as the last log in the hearth cracked and split, Margaret felt an ache deep in her chest, the kind that comes from missing someone you've never met. She whispered again, barely audible, "You're not here to harm me, are you?" The rocking slowed. The voice, softer now, replied only, "No, dear, I'm here because you came back." The fire dimmed to embers. The sound of rain swelled, folding the cottage once more into the night. And Margaret, trembling but strangely at peace, whispered back into the dark, "Then tell me why." Outside, thunder murmured low across the valley, and for a heartbeat, every drop of rain seemed to pause, as though the whole of Waverley Hollow had stopped to listen. The rain deepened its song, steady and silver, drumming softly against the cottage roof, like the slow ticking of an unseen clock. Margaret's whisper, "Then tell me why," seemed to dissolve into the sound. The rocking chairs stilled. Only the glow from the dying embers remained, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat in the dark. For a moment, she thought the presence was gone. Then, from somewhere between the walls and the rain, came a quiet sigh, like breath passing through old wood. "You promised you'd come back," the voice said, neither accusing nor kind, just tired. "You said you wouldn't leave before the storm ended." Margaret's throat tightened. "Who?" she whispered. "Who made that promise?" There was no reply, only the faint hum of a melody. It was an old tune, one she couldn't place, something half forgotten from another lifetime. The sound didn't come from the air, but from within the house itself, as though the floorboards and beams were remembering how to sing. Margaret rose and followed the sound, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. The melody led her toward the narrow hallway at the back of the cottage. A place she hadn't yet explored. The hallway smelled of damp cedar and candle wax. A single framed photograph hung crooked on the wall. A woman in a long dress, standing beside the same window where Margaret had been writing. Her expression was soft but weary. Her eyes turned slightly away from the camera. The The strange part wasn't her face, it was the child beside her, barefoot, smiling faintly. Margaret leaned closer. The photograph had warped with age, but she could still make out the details. The curls of the child's hair, the faint outline of rain streaking down the window behind them, and there, barely visible, the same teacup resting on the table, full and steaming. Margaret's reflection blurred in the glass. For an instant, she thought she saw the figures move. The woman turning her head, the child lifting a hand as if to wave. Then the light from the embers flickered, and they were still again. She stepped back, heart fluttering, and opened the door at the end of the hall. The room beyond was small, a nursery, though long abandoned. Dust drifted in the air like pale snow, and a broken mobile hung from the ceiling, its paper stars swaying with the breath of the wind. On the floor sat a wooden toy horse, its paint faded but its saddle intact. Margaret knelt, tracing the edge of it with trembling fingers. Beneath the toy lay a small book, its leather cracked with time. She lifted it gently and brushed away the dust. Inside, the pages were filled with careful handwriting. The first line read, "For Clara, when the rain comes." The entries that followed were dated 1883. Each one described the same storm, Aubert and Aubert, the same endless rain that refused to stop. The writer spoke of waiting, of a husband gone missing on the river road, and a daughter who kept asking when he'd return. As the days stretched into weeks, the tone shifted, sorrow deepening into fear. She says she hears him in the rain now. One entry read, "She says he calls her name from the trees." Margaret turned the last page. The ink was smeared, the writing frantic. "The water keeps rising. If he comes back tonight, I'll open the door. I'll open it! Even if it's only the rain wearing his voice." The final line trailed off mid-sentence. A chill crept through the room, sharp and certain. The scent of roses returned, stronger now, mingling with something older, damp soil, river water, candle smoke. Margaret clutched the diary to her chest and whispered, "Clara." The name felt fragile on her tongue, like something sacred. From the corner of the nursery came the faint sound of footsteps, soft, light, unmistakably those of a child. Margaret turned slowly, her breath catching. There, by the window, stood the same small figure from the photograph, barefoot, pale, her hair clinging damply to her face. She watched Margaret with calm, unblinking eyes. In her hands, she held the teacup. "I waited," the child said, her voice barely a breath. "Mama said you'd come when the rain stopped." Margaret froze, the words spinning through her mind like falling leaves. "I'm not your—" she began, but stopped. The child only smiled, tilting her head. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "You're here now." Then, as the lightning flashed beyond the trees, the figure faded, dissolving like mist, leaving only the faint outline of wet footprints leading back toward the door. Margaret stood alone in the silent nursery, heart thudding softly beneath the rhythm of the rain. Somewhere, far away, the church bell began to toll again. 12 slow chimes, each one echoing longer than the last. She whispered into the stillness, "Clara, what happened to you?" The rain answered first. empty house with a long, low creak, as though preparing to remember. The night seemed to hold its breath after Margaret spoke the child's name. The walls, the windows, even the rain itself, all waited, as if listening for something long denied. She stood in the nursery, the diary pressed to her chest, and the silence that followed was not empty, but full of stories not yet told. When the first gust of wind slipped through the half-open door, it carried with it the faint scent of lilac and ash, like the ghosts of spring trying to bloom inside winter. Margaret moved back to the main room, lighting another candle. The flame trembled, but didn't die. On the table, where she'd left the teacup earlier, steam still rose. She sat down slowly, opening the diary again under the wavering light. The ink was faded. The script elegant, a woman's hand, precise yet trembling. The next page she hadn't noticed before had been folded shut. "Say let be time." When she pried it open, a pressed flower fell out, a viola crushed flat, but still holding a whisper of color. Beneath it, another entry revealed itself. October 28th, 1883. The storm hasn't ended. The river swallowed half the valley. Jonah Pike came this morning, he said. The water took the bridge. He offered to take Clara and me to his barn on higher ground, but she refuses to leave. She says he'll come back to this house first. She sits by the window, watching the rain, humming the tune he used to play on the porch. I can't bear to tell her the truth. I can't bear to stop hoping. Margaret traced the words with her fingertips. The paper felt warm, almost alive beneath her touch. She whispered, "Jonah Pike." The name of her landlord, the same man, perhaps, or a descendant. The valley's families had lived here for generations, their names repeating like echoes down a long corridor of years. The candle flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open, though she had locked them all. Margaret rose, the diary still in hand, and followed the sound. The narrow hall glowed faintly, and at its far end, the photograph she'd seen earlier was no longer crooked. It hung straight now, perfectly centered. Beneath it, faint words had appeared on the wallpaper, lines written in charcoal, curling like vines. He'd never made it across the bridge. Her pulse quickened, but something deeper than fear anchored her, a strange compassion. Like the ache of remembering someone else's sorrow, the air thickened with the scent of river, water, and smoke. She turned back toward the sitting room, and for the first time she saw it clearly, the outline of a figure seated by the hearth, facing the rain, a woman in a dark dress, hair pinned up, shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying the weight of years. Her face was turned away, but her presence filled the room like a memory come home. Margaret stepped closer. "Are you Clara's?" "Mother?" she whispered. The figure did not move. Only the faint sound of the rocking chair continued, slow and rhythmic. Then, softly, "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was low, cracked with time. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Margaret said gently. "I'm just trying to understand." The woman turned her head slightly, just enough for Margaret to glimpse her profile. The features were blurred, as if painted by candlelight and mist. "Understanding won't bring him back," she said. "It won't stop The river. The river, the woman's eyes, pale as glass, met hers. When the dam broke, it took everything. The bridge, the road, the farm, and him. But the water carried his voice back here. We heard him in the rain for days, and when Clara followed it, the sentence faded, unfinished. The room seemed to tilt, the air pressing close around Margaret like a held breath. Followed it? She asked, though she already knew. The rocking stopped. The woman's gaze drifted toward the window, where the rain streaked in thin silver lines. She wanted to find him. Said the rain would show her the way. I called her name, but she was already in the river before I reached the door. Margaret swallowed hard. The candle beside her hissed and went out, leaving only the soft glow from the hearth. You stayed, she whispered. Someone had to wait, the woman said. He promised to come back before the storm ended. The words echoed through the room like a sigh too heavy to fade. Margaret stood very still, watching as the woman's outline began to dim, dissolving into the shadows cast by the fire. Did he ever return? Margaret asked that. The answer came as faint as rain on glass. Not to me. Then she was gone. The chair swayed once more, then stilled. Margaret sat alone again. The diary opened on her knees. The last page fluttered in the wind from the chimney, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw new words bleeding through the paper, words that hadn't been there before. You came back so we could rest. The rain outside softened it to a whisper, the kind that sounds like breathing, and for the first time that night, the cottage beneath the rain felt almost still. Asterisked the words on the page glowed faintly before fading into the paper's grain, as if the house itself had exhaled them. You came back so we could rest. Margaret stared at the diary until her eyes blurred, her mind swimming between wonder and exhaustion. The cottage was quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of silence that feels alive. Listening, she set the book down gently on the table, and the sound of its cover closing seemed almost reverent, like the ending of a prayer. Outside, the rain softened to a hush. Though thunder still murmured somewhere over the hollow, Margaret stood and approached the window. The forest was wrapped in mist, silver and still, the earth steaming where the water had touched it. In the dim light of dawn, she could see the outline of the river below, swollen and restless, snaking through the valley like a wound that refused to heal. For the first time, she noticed what looked like a shape rising from its edge, the broken bones of an old wooden bridge. Jonah Pike's voice echoed in her memory. The river took the bridge. A sudden compulsion stirred in her, not of curiosity, but of duty. Something inside the cottage seemed to urge her toward that place, the way a dream tugs at you just before waking. She put on her coat, lit the lantern, and stepped outside. The rain met her with a whisper, cool and tender on her skin. The path down to the river was narrow, half swallowed by moss and thyme. Wait, ehi, step. The world seemed to dim. Even the sounds of the forest faded, leaving only the soft thud of raindrops on wet leaves. By the time she reached the clearing, the mist had thickened into a low, silver veil. The remains of the bridge jutted from the water like ribs. Planks, broken rope, dark with decay, yet something shimmered at its center, a pale glint beneath the current. Margaret knelt at the riverbank, the lantern trembling in her hand. Beneath the swirling water, she could make out the outline of a ring, gold, old-fashioned, still clinging to a finger bone buried in silt. The sight made her breath catch, not in fear but recognition, because the ring, though half buried and worn, matched the one she wore around her neck, strung on a chain since childhood. Her grandmother's ring, she'd been told, a family heirloom passed through the generations, its origin forgotten. Until now, she reached into the water. The current was cold, biting, as though the river remembered her before she remembered herself. Her fingers brushed the ring, and the world seemed to flicker. In that moment, the rain stopped. A vision or memory unfolded before her eyes. The same cottage, brighter, alive with laughter. The woman she'd seen before stood by the hearth, humming softly as a man came through the door, dripping wet, his arms full of firewood. The child, Clara, ran to him, and he lifted her high, spinning her until both laughed breathlessly. But as he turned toward the window, Margaret saw his face, and her heart clenched. It was her own, or rather, a version of her face, reshaped by another century's shadow. The scene blurred. The man walked out again toward the rising river, promising to return before the storm ended. Then everything dissolved in white. Margaret gasped, the present rushing back in like cold air. Her fingers clutched the ring, which had come free from the current. The finger bone was gone, washed away as if released. She turned it over in her palm, the engraving still visible beneath the wear. M.W.H.E.R. initials. For a long moment, she knelt in silence. The realization unfurled slowly, tenderly. She wasn't merely a visitor to this cottage. She was its echo, another link in a chain that had never broken, only looped back through blood and memory. The river had called her not to frighten her, but to finish the story, to remember what love and loss had left behind. The rain began again, softer now, like applause from the leaves. Margaret whispered into the mist, "He came back, didn't they?" And the wind answered, carrying a voice she knew without knowing. Always. The mist parted, revealing the faint shapes of 3 figures standing on the far side of the river. A man, a woman, and a child. They were smiling, faintly, glowing with the light of dawn. The child waved once, then turned toward the trees. One by one, they faded into the mist until nothing remained but rain. Margaret pressed the ring to her chest. The ache that had haunted the valley for a century lifted, quiet, weightless. She looked back toward the cottage. The lantern light in its window flickered like a heartbeat, steady, alive. She whispered, "Rest now," and began to walk home. Behind her, the river ran calmly for the first time in generations. The bridge, though broken, no longer groaned under the weight of memory, and as she stepped through the doorway, the scent of roses returned, faint and warm, a farewell from those who had waited too long. Asterisk. The morning rain had softened into a silver drizzle by the time Margaret returned to the cottage. The air felt different, now lighter, freer, as if the valley itself had taken a long, trembling breath after holding it for a century. She closed the door behind her, setting the lantern on the windowsill. The flame flickered once and steadied, its glow spilling gently across the wooden floorboards. The cottage was utterly still, yet not empty. It hummed quietly, like a seashell pressed against the ear. The sound of something vast and unseen. Margaret looked around and realized that every small detail had changed. The cobwebs that had once clung to the rafters were gone. The damp smell of decay had lifted, replaced by the faint sweetness of baked bread and wild roses. Even the photographs on the mantel, the ones that had been faded and water-stained, now showed faces she could recognize. The woman from the vision smiled back at her, holding the child in her arms, while the man stood proudly beside them. Margaret's throat tightened. She whispered their names, though she couldn't remember ever learning them. Eleanor, Thomas, Clara. The words tasted familiar, like a lullaby half remembered from another life. As she reached out to touch the frame, a faint warmth pulsed beneath her fingertips. The light in the room shifted, not brighter, but deeper, as if morning itself had bowed its head in reverence. Margaret sat by the fire, though there was no wood burning, no smoke rising, and yet the hearth glowed softly, a slow amber pulse that felt alive. She opened her grandmother's diary once more. This time, the ink was clear, no longer smudged or blurred by time. The final entry read, "If one day our blood returns to this valley, may the rain forgive what we could not. May love remember the way home." Margaret read the words again, slower, letting them seep into her bones. The weight she had carried all her life, the inexplicable melancholy that followed her, like a shadow, finally began to dissolve. The storm had not been a curse, but a calling. The cottage had not been haunted by the dead, but by a story unfinished. She closed the diary and rested her hands on her knees. Outside, the rain became a whispering rhythm, steady and soft, a lullaby from the earth itself. The sound of water against the roof tiles echoed like gentle applause. For a long while she sat there, listening. Then something delicate caught her eye. A flicker of movement near the corner of the room. The old music box she'd found earlier, the one that had refused to open, now clicked once, twice, then began to play. The melody was faint, slow, heartbreakingly familiar. Margaret stood, drawn to it, and when she lifted the lid, she found not the brass gears she expected, but a single pressed flower, a wild rose, perfectly preserved. She smiled, tears warming her eyes. The cottage had kept this for her. For all of them. The melody slowed, one note lingering longer than it should, as if reluctant to end. She whispered to the air, "Thank you." The wind stirred the curtains in reply, moving gently through the room, brushing her hair like a hand she could not see. For the first time, Margaret felt no fear of being alone. She knew that she wasn't. Not really. She belonged to this place, Anditoer. Every echo of laughter, every drop of rain on the roof, every sigh of wind through the trees, all of it was memory made sound. She walked to the door and opened it. The morning had cleared into a pale, luminous gray. The forest shimmered with dew, and mist rose in ribbons from the earth. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed once, then again, carried on the breeze from the old town far below. Margaret stepped out into the damp grass, and looked toward the horizon. The cottage behind her glowed faintly in the mist, not ghostly, but alive, as if it too had awakened from a long dream. She whispered, "Rest now," and the words seemed to echo far beyond the valley, into the hills, into the rain, into the quiet hearts of all who had waited. She turned to leave, but before she took her first step down the path, she looked back one last time. Into window she saw reflection, her own but layer. Faintly over it were 3 others, smiling softly, their faces peaceful. The woman, the man, and the child. Then the image faded, leaving only the soft flicker of light. Margaret walked down the winding path, her boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. The rain had stopped. Only the drip of water from the leaves accompanied her. Somewhere, a bird began to sing, a sound fragile and new, like forgiveness. The valley was free. The story complete. By the time she reached the bend in the road, the cottage was hidden behind the trees, but she could still feel its warmth, pulsing faintly through the mist, a heartbeat beneath the rain. And in that quiet, the whisper came once more, carried on the wind like a benediction. "You came back so we could rest." She smiled through her tears. "Then rest," she said softly, "and dream." The rain began again, gentle and kind, a hymn for endings and beginnings alike. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep, and if you've found calm within the whisper of the rain tonight, I invite you to stay a little longer, to subscribe to Midnight Murmurs Radio, where stories like this will always find you when the world grows quiet. Asterisk, the rain had ended, but the world still shimmered with its memory. The valley lay quiet beneath a pale morning sky, every leaf and blade of grass jeweled with dew. Margaret stood on the ridge above the cottage, watching mist drift lazily across the river below. The air smelled of wet pine and iron-rich soil, and somewhere deep within the forest a woodpecker tapped gently against hollow bark. It was the first sound of day. She had not meant to stay, but the cottage, that gentle, breathing relic of time, had a way of keeping her near. Each step she took away from it felt like walking through a dream that refused to end. She turned the ring in her fingers, the one she had found in the river. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, still warm despite the chill. M.W. The initials carved upon it no longer frightened her. They felt like a promise fulfilled. Yet beneath that peace was an ache, subtle and lingering, the kind that hums in the heart long after tears have dried. The cottage's windows glowed faintly behind her, a steady amber pulse, like the last ember of a long night. As she watched, the wind lifted her hair, carrying with it the faintest scent of roses again. Margaret smiled. "You can rest now," she whispered. But even as she said it, a quiet thought rippled beneath her calm. And what about me? She made her way down the winding path toward the village below. It had been years, decades perhaps, since she'd last walked those roads, though she couldn't remember when or why she'd left. The world below seemed to belong to another age, its edges blurred by the years she had spent wandering, searching, waiting for something unnamed. When she reached the foot of the hill, she saw the remnants of an old signpost half buried in moss. The words were faded, barely legible, but she could still make out a single line: "Welcome to Hollowmere, founded 1827. The name stirred something deep in her bones. She'd read it once, long ago, in a letter she was never meant to find. Hollowmere, the town her grandmother had left behind after the storm that took everything, the one she had vowed never to return to. Margaret followed the muddy road until it opened into a small clearing where the remnants of a church stood. The bell tower, long collapsed, lay scattered among the weeds, its stones slick with rain. Wildflowers grew between the cracks. She stepped inside the ruin, and her footsteps echoed faintly against the hollow space. The altar was gone, but in its place stood a wooden cross, carved roughly and tied together with old rope. At its base rested a handful of smooth river stones, placed there with quiet reverence. Some bore initials, others dates. Margaret knelt beside them and traced the letters, carved into one. E.B. 1894. Another read, T.W. 1894. The breath caught in her throat. Eleanor Blackwood, Thomas Whittaker. She whispered the name softly, the sound trembling in the still air. So that was where they rested here, not far from the cottage. The place where their lives had ended and where her own had somehow begun. As she bowed her head, the sky shifted, a low rumble of thunder rolling somewhere beyond the hills. The light dimmed for a moment, as if the clouds were remembering too. Margaret closed her eyes. The scent of roses returned again, stronger now, mingled with the faint salt of tears. When she opened them, the world around her seemed subtly altered. The walls were whole, the floor swept clean, and candles flickered in the windows. The church was alive again, if only for a heartbeat. And standing near the altar was a figure, not frightening, not even ghostly, but calm and luminous, as if made of memory and mist. A woman in a pale dress, her hair braided and pinned, her face soft with sorrow and peace. Eleanor, she smiled at Margaret, a slow, knowing smile that carried the weight of 100 unspoken words. Margaret didn't move, didn't breathe. The woman lifted her hand, gesturing toward the door. Beyond it, through the shifting light, Margaret could see the outline of the cottage far away, glowing faintly even in daylight. The message was clear, though no words passed between them. There is still more to remember. Then the vision faded, the church returned to silence, the ruin once more. The air was still again, the only sound, the drip of water from the broken beams. Marguerite remained kneeling for a while, her heart quiet, her mind tracing the edge between the living and the remembered. When she finally stood, she felt no fear, only a deep, gentle pull, like the tide returning home. She looked once more toward the cottage and began to walk. The mist parted for her as she moved, revealing the narrow path that wound through the pines, shining wet beneath the morning light. Somewhere above, a single raven called, its voice echoing down the valley like an ancient blessing. The world felt new again, as though waking from a dream. As the story fades, allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep. The afternoon light had turned thin and pale by the time Margaret reached the cottage again. The air carried that quiet, silvery glow that always follows a long storm, as though the clouds themselves were too tired to leave. The forest around her shimmered with a faint mist, curling through the trees like the breath of something ancient and kind. She paused at the gate, her hand resting on the worn wood. The ring she had found at the river still hung from its chain against her heart, and the faint warmth of it seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the rain-soaked earth. The cottage stood waiting, the faint glow in its windows unchanged, though the air around it felt more alive than before. When she stepped inside, the familiar scent greeted her again, not dust or decay, but the sweet echo of wild roses, the smell of old pages and cedarwood. The fireplace, though unlit, gave off a warmth that was not from fire, but from memory itself. Margaret set her bag on the table and noticed something she had done. To send before a small envelope resting on the mantel, its paper yellowed but unwrinkled, as though time had forgotten to touch it. Her name was written on the front in a delicate hand. To Margaret, when the rain ends. For a long moment, she just stared at it, heart trembling with a mix of hesitation and inevitability. Then she slid her finger beneath the seal and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, written in faded ink. "My dearest Margaret," it began, "if you have come this far, then you have already walked the road we could not. The storm that took us was not cruel. It was only memory refusing to fade. The rain remembers, even when we cannot. We built this cottage for love, not for sorrow. But love, when buried, becomes a ghost. We have waited for you, not to haunt, but to thank you. The past cannot rest until it is remembered kindly." The letter was signed with 3 names: Eleanor, Thomas, and Clara. Her breath caught in her chest as she traced the ink. It was not just a message, it was a release, an offering of peace passed down through generations of longing. The walls seemed to hum faintly as she read, as though the cottage itself was exhaling at last. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the mantel. "You're free now," she whispered. "All of you." Outside, the wind stirred gently through the trees, brushing against the windows like a sigh of gratitude. But even in the calm, Margaret felt something stirring, a pull deeper into the house, toward the locked room at the back she had not dared to open since the first night. The key still hung from the nail beside the door. It was iron, rusted, shaped like an old heart. She took it down, feeling its cool weight in her palm, and walked slowly to the room. The doorknob resisted her touch, as if asking one final time if she was certain. She turned it. Anyway, the door creaked open, revealing a small, shadowed space lined with shelves and dust-laden relics. The air was cool and still, yet it carried the faint hum of something unseen, the echo of voices long gone. In the center stood a cradle, carved from oak, its blanket yellowed with age. Margaret stepped closer, her lantern trembling slightly in her grasp. Inside the cradle was a small wooden box, tied with faded ribbon. She untied it carefully and lifted the lid. Inside lay a lock of dark hair, tied with thread, and a photograph. A man, a woman, and a child standing before the same cottage under a bright summer sky. The man's hand rested protectively on the woman's shoulder. The child held a wild rose. Margaret traced their faces gently. They were smiling, truly smiling. The photograph felt warm, as though sunlight had been trapped inside it. Beneath it was a scrap of paper, folded small, the ink barely legible. For whoever finds this, know that love does not end, even when with a single tear slipped down her cheek. Before she even realized it had fallen, she sat beside the cradle, the rain's memory whispering softly against the windows. For the first time, she felt something like rest, not the shallow quiet of exhaustion, but the deep peace of belonging. The cottage had found its voice, and she had found her home within it. Outside, twilight descended slowly, painting the valley in blue and gold. The world seemed to hold its breath, suspended between day and night, memory and dream. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, she thought she saw a faint glow in the cradle. Not bright, but gentle, like a candle flickering in another room. She smiled through her tears, whispered, "Sleep now," and the glow dimmed to nothing. The silence that followed was complete, beautiful, and whole. The past had finally gone quiet. The moon rose early that night, pale and wide above the valley, veiled by threads of drifting cloud. The rain had long stopped, yet its rhythm still lingered in the air, in the faint hiss of winds through wet leaves, in the distant whisper of the river below. Margaret sat by the window of the cottage, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, staring out into the silvery blur of night. Everything around her was still, but not lifeless. The cottage seemed to breathe, each creak and sigh part of an ancient language only she could now understand. She felt the deep calm of completion, but also something else, a hollow space where the past had been. Sometimes peace is too quiet, and in that quiet, questions begin to stir. She turned the ring around her finger, its engraving warm beneath her touch. M.W. the initials that now belonged to every woman before her, and perhaps every woman after. Margaret wondered if this was what her grandmother had felt to the strange pool of remembering, the ache of stories that refused to stay buried. The moonlight caught the corner of the old diary on the table. It was open to a page she hadn't left it on. Her pulse quickened as she leaned forward. The ink shimmered faintly as though freshly written. If the rain has ended, the last truth remains within the hollow. Beneath it, a small map was sketched, the outline of the valley, the river, and a mark deeper within the forest. Near the ridge she had never climbed. Margaret frowned. The handwriting was her grandmother's, or perhaps her own. Her own. The thought made her chest tighten, but she couldn't look away. The map called to her with the same quiet insistence as the river had days before. She folded the page gently and tucked the diary into her coat pocket. "Just one more step," she whispered to the silence, though she wasn't sure who she was speaking to, the spirits, herself, or the rain. She lit the lantern and stepped outside. The world was silver and black, the forest humming with unseen life. Each step she took sent ripples through puddles that reflected the moonlight like fragments of broken glass. The path narrowed, winding upward through ferns and moss-dripped branches. Somewhere in the distance, an owl cayet, low and mournful, its voice echoing across the hollow. As she climbed, the air grew colder, sharper, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and pine resin. The forest here felt older, untouched by time. The trees rose like pillars of a forgotten temple, their roots weaving together in patterns that seemed deliberate. When she reached the ridge, The mist parted just enough to reveal a clearing, small, circular, enclosed by ancient birches. At its center stood a single stone, tall and smooth, its surface carved with faint markings, almost erased by weather and age. Margaret approached it slowly, her lantern casting soft gold against its face. The carvings were words, not in any language she recognized, but familiar somehow, their shapes stirring something deep in her chest. She reached out to touch them, and the instant her fingers brushed the stone, the ground beneath her seemed to pulse. The air filled with a low hum, the sound of rain, remembered but not falling. The forest shimmered just for a heartbeat, and she was no longer standing alone. All around her, faint figures appeared, woven from mist and moonlight. Men and women, children, their outlines flickering like candlelight. They stood among the trees, silent but not sorrowful, watching her with eyes full of quiet recognition. Margaret's breath trembled in her throat. "Who are you?" she whispered, though in her heart she already knew. They were the valley itself, every soul that had ever called it home, every whisper the rain had ever carried. The mist moved, and from among them stepped Eleanor, the same calm face, the same light in her eyes. She spoke without sound, her words arriving as warmth in Margaret's chest. The hollow remembers what the heart forgets. You have given us rest. Now remember yourself. The lantern's flame flickered violently, then steadied again. Margaret felt tears slide down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. The mist began to lift, one figure at a time, dissolving into the light. When the last had vanished, only the stone remained, glowing faintly beneath her hand. The hum faded, replaced by the sound of leaves brushing softly against one another. She sank to her knees, the earth damp beneath her, and for a long while she simply breathed, the air cold, the stars beginning to appear through torn clouds. The valley had gone still again, but it was no longer a haunted stillness. It was peace, real, deep, ancient peace. Margaret rose slowly, looked once more at the stone, and whispered, "Thank you," as she turned to leave. A faint glimmer caught her eye, a single white rose blooming from the soil at the stone's base, its petals gleaming like frost. She smiled, gently touched it, then began the walk back toward the cottage, lantern light guiding her through the quiet trees. Above her, the moon drifted higher, and the rain clouds finally broke apart into stars asterisk. The path back to the cottage felt longer than before, though Margaret could not tell if it was because of the hour or the weight of what she had seen. The night had settled deep into the valley, thick and velvet black, pierced only by her lantern's trembling light. Each footstep was swallowed quickly by the damp earth, as if the forest itself wanted to keep her secret. The mist followed at her heels, slow and deliberate, curling between the trees, like breath that refused to fade. By the time she reached the clearing where the cottage stood, the moon had slipped behind the clouds again. The air was cool, rich with the scent of rain-soaked wood. She paused at the threshold, taking in the soft hum that still lingered in the air, a kind of low vibration that wasn't quite a sound, but a presence. The cottage, as ever, seemed awake. Margaret pushed open the door and stepped inside. Everything was just as she had left it. The empty teacup by the window, the folded letter on the mantel, the diary resting open on the table. But there was something new, a faint trail of water droplets leading from the door toward the hearth, as though someone had walked in just moments before her. She froze. The air felt charged, tender, not threatening. The rain had returned outside, tapping softly against the windowpane. Margaret followed the droplets slowly. They stopped before the fireplace, where the air shimmered faintly, as if disturbed by invisible motion. Then, without warning, the lantern flame dimmed, and in that hush, she heard it, the sound of humming, low, gentle, familiar, the same lullaby she had heard in her visions, the one the woman by the hearth used to sing to the child. Margaret closed her eyes, letting the sound move through her. It wasn't eerie. It was heartbreakingly beautiful, like the memory of being held. When she opened her eyes again, a faint glow pulsed near the fireplace. Within it stood 3 shapes, not solid, but woven of light and rain. Eleanor, Thomas, and Clara. The same peaceful faces she had seen across the river. Now clearer, nearer. Eleanor's voice came softly, though her lips did not move. You found the hollow, Jew? Free us. But there is one thing left. Margaret swallowed hard. What is it? This story isn't only ours, the voice replied. It's yours too. You've carried the echo longer than you know. The ring was never lost. It was waiting. Thomas stepped forward, his hand reaching toward hers. She felt warmth, real, solid, as if the boundary between the living and the remembered had grown thin enough to breathe through. He placed his hand over the ring hanging from her chain. It belonged to you once, and to every heart that remembered love through the storm. The rain carries memory, but the heart keeps truth. Margaret's vision blurred with tears. Then what am I supposed to do? The little girl, Clara, smiled faintly, her voice a whisper of wind. Stay. Remember. Let the cottage dream again. The light around them began to dim, the outlines of their faces fading slowly into the glow of the hearth. The humming turned softer until it became only the sound of rain. Margaret reached out, desperate to hold on to that warmth for just a moment longer, but her hands met only air. And then they were gone. The lantern flared, steady once more. The cottage fell still. Only the whisper of rain and the slow rhythm of her own breath filled the space. Marguerite sat down by the fire, her hands trembling, her heart both heavy and unburdened. She felt the truth of what they'd said, that she was part of the story, not by chance but by blood, by time, by the quiet continuity of love that had survived every storm. The cottage had not called her to witness the past. It had called her home. She looked down at the ring again and, for the first time, slipped it on to her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for that moment across lifetimes. The weight of it grounded her, pulling her gently into the present. Outside, the rain began to change, softer now, almost melodic. It drummed on the roof like a heartbeat, steady and calm. The old clock on the mantel began to tick again. It hadn't moved in decades. Each second fell like a sigh. Margaret leaned back, her eyes growing heavy. The room seemed to glow from within, bathed in warm amber light. The cottage had found peace, and so had she. As her eyes drifted shut, she heard one last whisper in the dark, her grandmother's voice, clear as the sound of rain. "Sleep now, Margaret, the story is whole again." And with that the lantern's flame flickered once, then steadied into silence. Outside, the valley exhaled, the rain easing into a soft, endless lullaby * epilogue, The Rainkeeper's Cottage by dawn. The rain had quieted into a mist that clung gently to the valley, turning every branch, every blade of grass, into a thread of silver. The old cottage stood beneath the lingering clouds, like something half-remembered, fragile, eternal, alive. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the faint scent of ash and lavender. Margaret stirred from her slumber by the hearth. For a moment, she didn't know if it was morning or a dream continuing. The light had that strange forgiving glow, the kind that feels like both an ending and a beginning. Her hand rested on the ring, still cool against her skin. The old clock ticked softly in rhythm with the rain outside. She rose slowly, her movements unhurried, and crossed to the window. Beyond it, the valley shimmered as if it were breathing, every droplet of rain reflecting the soft light of dawn. In that reflection, she thought she saw them. Eleanor standing by the river's bend, Thomas beside her, little Clara chasing the first light through the trees. They did not fade this time. They simply smiled, like old friends watching over her from the far side of memory. The mist swirled, and they were gone, leaving only the quiet promise that they were never far. Margaret smiled faintly, a tear slipping free not of sorrow, but gratitude. She turned toward the table, where her grandmother's diary still lay open. The ink shimmered faintly on the page, as if newly written, though she hadn't touched it since the night before. A new line had appeared beneath the final entry. "Those who remember the rain will never walk alone." Her breath caught. The air around her seemed to pulse gently, not hauntingly, but protectively, as though the cottage itself had spoken. She reached out and brushed her fingers over the words. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying a whisper that seemed to echo through the hollow. Welcome home. Later that morning, when the sun finally broke through the clouds, Margaret stepped outside. The path that had been muddy and treacherous was now soft and glistening, lined with tiny white flowers that had bloomed overnight. She knelt and touched one. Its petals were damp but strong. Like something reborn, the valley was still, except for the quiet rush of a nearby stream, and from far off, the faint tolling of a bell she had never noticed before. A church, perhaps, or something older. She turned back to the cottage. The old roof shimmered under the light, and for a brief instant, she saw it not as it was worn and creaking, but as it once might have been. Fresh wood, white curtains, laughter inside, the sound of piano keys and rain mixing together. A home suspended between centuries, still dreaming. Margaret took one last look before stepping down the trail. She didn't lock the door. The cottage had no need for locks anymore. It had her memory to guard it now. The forest seemed to open before her as she walked, the scent of wet pine and loam filling her lungs. Each step carried her further from the shadows and deeper into something tender and whole. The rain had left behind a rhythm, one she could still hear under her breath. Not haunting, not sorrowful, but steady, alive. By the time she reached the curve of the hill, the valley below had begun to glow with morning light. She turned once more. Through the veil of mist, she thought she saw the faint outline of the cottage, and in its window, the golden flicker of a lantern. It burned softly, endlessly, like a heartbeat. Evelyn Blackwood's voice returns, low and calm, carried like the final ripple on still water. The cottage beneath the rain still stands, somewhere between memory and dream, waiting for those who listen, those who remember that love, once lost, can always find its way home. Through the quiet song of the rain, the music swells softly behind her, a tender harmony of wind and dripping leaves. As the story fades, she whispers, "Allow yourself to drift into a peaceful sleep." The rain never truly ends in Waverly Hollow. It only learns to fall softer. Tonight, as you lie beneath your blankets and listen to the faint rhythm against your window, know that somewhere, deep in the misty folds of the valley, the cottage still breathes. The lamp by its window flickers with a steady golden glow, guiding lost travelers and wandering hearts toward peace. Its walls, aged and warm, remember every voice that ever sought comfort there. Margaret's story is no longer one of sorrow. It is a lullaby, written in rain and kept alive by those who dream. When you listen closely, between the breaths of thunder and the sigh of the wind, you can almost hear her humming softly by the hearth, her voice blending with the quiet music of falling rain. Maybe you've been there before, in another time, another dream when you stood by the old wooden door and smelled the scent of cedar and wet earth, when the world outside felt too heavy, and the only thing that mattered was the soft promise of rest. That's what the cottage beneath the rain has always been. Not a place, but a feeling. A memory passed down like an echo through hearts that needed gentleness. Some say it was built over a century ago by a clockmaker who believed time could heal anything if measured in moments of stillness. Others whispered that it simply appeared one autumn, rising from the fog like an answered prayer. No one truly knows. What matters is that it still waits patiently in that quiet space where the living and the remembered touch hand. So tonight, as the rain drifts across your dreams, let your thoughts wander there. Imagine the sound of the fire crackling softly, the scent of rain-damp pine wood, and the gentle tick of the old clock on the mantel. Let it all slow until time itself feels as though it has curled up beside you, breathing in rhythm with your heart. In this stillness, you are safe. In this story, you belong. The past has folded itself into the present, and every drop of rain carries your name. Every echo, every heartbeat is a promise that you are not forgotten. The rain remembers. It always does. So rest now, listener of the night. Let your thoughts drift like leaves on a quiet stream. Feel your breath soften, your body grow lighter, your worries fade into the gentle rhythm of falling rain. Somewhere, a door creaks open. Somewhere, a warm light glows through mist. Somewhere, the story continues endlessly, peacefully, beneath the rain. Evelyn's voice fades to a whisper. This is Evelyn Blackwood from Midnight Murmurs Radio. Thank you for joining me in tonight's story, The Cottage beneath the rain. Until we meet again, may your dreams be gentle, your heart untroubled, and your sleep peaceful. The final notes of piano drift through the dark, soft, distant, like raindrops tracing the edges of a dream. Then silence, deep and comforting, settles in a silence that hums quietly with life, like the world breathing after the rain.